Good morning, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of Coffee and Something Stronger. My name is Cody Norris, Executive Director of Georgia Interfaith Power and Light. Coffee and Something Stronger is a coffee chat style interview show where we sit down with academics, faith leaders, and practitioners to talk about the intersections of climate change, faith, social justice, and environmental justice. And this morning, it's a rare treat. We have on a good friend and favorite professor of mine, Professor Emeritus at Candler School of Theology and of Emory's Graduate Division of Religion, Dr. Carol Newsom, who specializes in so many things, including the Dead Sea Scrolls, biblical wisdom traditions, apocalyptic literature, and so many other things. And in particular, this morning, we're going to be talking about how all of those things intersect with environmental and ecological concerns. Dr. Newsom, thank you for joining this morning.
My pleasure.
I really appreciate it. So if you would just briefly introduce yourself and say a little bit about how you got to where you are now, and then I'll ask you to offer your reading.
Okay. Well, as you noted, I have spent my career teaching at the Candler School of Theology at Emory University. And I should say it's the one and only job I ever interviewed for, the one and only job I ever had. And so it's been delightful to spend really almost 40 years there watching the school develop and watching the university embrace a really committed stance on ecology and environmental responsibility. I've been very proud to be part of that community, but it's nice to be retired now too.
Well, thank you for giving up some of your time to be here with us this morning. I'll ask you to start us with just offering the reading that you have.
Okay, when you asked me about a reading, I considered a number of things, but of course, as a biblical scholar, I have to come back to the Bible. And as someone who's devoted a lot of time to the book of Job, one of my favorites, I just inevitably gravitated back toward that. And especially God's speech to Job. When Job has been raging on about a set of issues the way he wanted to define them, and instead God responds with the most remarkable nature poetry in the entire Bible. Now, we won't have time to talk about how this all fits into the book of Job, but the part that I wanted to read, the poem that I wanted to read, is God is describing the different wild animals to Job, the ones that do not care about human beings, owe human beings nothing, but whom God takes care of. And when Job doesn't seem to get it, God does take two and says, okay, Job, I'm going to talk about big animals, really big animals. And I'm going to do this in all caps. And so he introduces this part of the poem with the animal behemoth. And the Hebrew behemoth simply means magnificent animal. That is, the form of the word means the animal par excellence. So this is God's take on animal nature. And the first thing he says to Job, this is from chapter, I'm reading out of the Jewish version of the Bible. And so the chapter and verse numbers are a little different from the Christian Bible, but it's in chapter 40. And he says, now observe Behemoth, whom I made just as I made you. He eats grass like the cattle. He's got strength in his loins. His might is in the muscles of his belly, and he makes his tail stand up like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are knit together. His bones are like tubes of bronze, his limbs like iron rods. He is the first, the best of God's works. Only his maker could draw the sword against him. The mountains yield him produce, where all the beasts of the fields play. He lies down beneath the lotuses in the cover of the swamp reeds. The lotuses embower him with shade. The willows of the brook surround him. He could restrain the river from its rushing. He is confident the stream would gush at his command.
Thank you for that. And Leah, what is the importance to you of that passage?
It draws on some really interesting language in which Job has been putting himself at the center of all meaning. And this is a reminder from God, look at this creature, the animal, whom I made just as I made you. In fact, he's the chief of my creations. And so I think one of the things, which certainly as we read this passage, we realize is that we tend to like to read Genesis 1, where we're made in the image and likeness, and so have a privileged place. And that text is certainly part of the canon, but so is this text, which challenges human uniqueness and even human dominance, I think. So it's a counterpoint to Genesis 1. And I think is one that it does us well to pay attention to.
Definitely. No, I so appreciate you offering that text and bringing it forward. Well, to start, I wanted to ask you, kind of leaping off of this perhaps, when you were in the midst of teaching at Candler and thought about introducing, these concerns about ecology and thinking about teaching a course on the environment, how did that come to be and what kind of spurred that on for you?
Yeah, well, I think like most people who want to teach in this area, it was oftentimes not a part of our training. But I realized that, especially because most of my students were going to be taking up positions of leadership, either within local churches or in nonprofits or in other forms of advocacy, that I thought I really want to help make connections between the biblical texts and traditions and the kind of work that they're going to be doing. And so the environmental concerns were the ones that felt most acute to me. And in particular, the primary motivation for this was my deep concern and fear over the issues of climate change. And I was also aware of how controversial this topic is in a lot of religious communities, particularly those that are coming out of the evangelical tradition. And yet the evangelical tradition also puts a very high value on scripture. So
Right.
on the one hand, a biblical text, a biblical course dealing with these kinds of issues already finds some common ground to speak. But when I started to put together the class and I tried to foreground these issues the first time I did it, I got a lot of caution from that first group of students, because they said, we're on board with this, but we would not be able to take this material and teach it in our congregations. It would be counterproductive.
Yeah.
And so I was really distressed by that. But I thought it's always better to figure out how you can first establish common ground with people, then and common ground and trust. And when you've got that, then you're able to edge the conversation towards some issues that you may not have as much agreement on, or there may be difficult issues. And so I got to thinking, okay, wait a minute, I'm going to have to redesign this course. I'm going to have to make it more adaptable to a wider range of congregations, not just the already committed. And so I thought, what's the entry point? And I realized it's food. It's food. There is nothing that is so central either to church community, or really when you look at to rituals, both in Christianity and Judaism, than food is. And once you've got people talking about food, and then it's very easy to shift to how food gets produced, agriculture, animals, how we have already reflected on this in many ways in theological tradition and biblical tradition. And then from there, you can get into how agriculture interacts with the larger environmental issues. And if you care about food, if you care about farming and farmers and the animals and the crops, you're going to care about the climate. And so once you can get that conversation started, then I think it can be really open-ended. So that's what I did. I shifted the focus of the course to make it center on food.
Yeah, who doesn't want to talk about food anyway?
Yes. We even, in fact, I included a little segment in the classes that we call food for thought. And a student each time would bring in some item of food that could, small item food, but could be shared with the others, but that had a story connected with it. And so in one case, I know one of the students went to Emery's Farmers Market and bought a little bottle of honey and some pretzel sticks, and he brought it over and we all dipped in and shared it. And he was talking about the producer and his bees and the issues that bees were facing. So we had a number of people who did different. The one person brought in junk food, organic junk food. And so we were able to get into a conversation about greenwashing, about different sorts of things. But it was always spontaneously instigated by whoever had seen some food item that would then cause us to think more deeply about issues.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I know when we were preparing for this conversation, I was reminded of the talk that you gave at Cameron Centennial, and preparing for that conversation on talking about the environment and climate change. And that was actually my first year at Candler School of Theology was that year, and hearing that conversation. And so I wondered if you would talk a little bit about what you shared about preparing for that and how it struck you in the conversation itself.
Yeah. The very first time I taught the course on the Bible and the care of the earth was probably in the around 2006, 2008, sometime around then. And things were serious, but we were all solution oriented. By the time I got around to doing the Centennial lecture and then writing it up, it's 2014, 2015. And the terrifying realization of just how far down the road we were toward the point of no return on runaway global warming. I realized there was no way I could do this upbeat, we just all have to get together and act out our values, etc. And so I thought, no, I've got to do a very different kind of talk this time. I have to help us face the deepest of our fears and to try to see if we can do that and yet find some ground for avoiding despair and finding some kind of hope that comes out of the biblical and theological tradition. So that wasn't easy, and preparing for that, it was a genuinely frightening experience as I went through and read the literature on what was happening. And the point that I found for where I could put biblical texts and traditions together with what I was learning about the human impact on the environment and the climate was to look at anthropology, both scientific anthropology. How did it happen that humans became this kind of a species that has had a completely different kind of impact on the environment?
Right.
And looking at the biblical traditions about anthropology, what are its reflections on who people are? And the point of connection between the two of them, of course, well, in the biblical tradition, you have the story in Genesis 2-3, in which, in that creation story, God first creates this human being, but who's not fully human as we know today, right. And then said, probably lonely. I need to make a companion. And so makes the other animals, because you realize at this point, I mean, that's what we are, we're animals. And from God's point of view, there's no difference then between Adam and the other animals that are made. Now, the fact that Adam doesn't find his closest companion among the animals is not a denigration that the animals are lesser. It's just that the story has also got to account for how come we've got male and female biologically as part of humans. So that's got to be part of the story too. But what I thought was so interesting was that as this story begins, there's two kinds of beings. There's divine beings and there's animals. And we're the animals. By the end of the story, when the humans have done what? They have eaten from the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. And after that, they become partially like gods or like God. That is what this story is saying, is that as we puzzle over who human beings are, we're sort of animals, but we're sort of gods. But we're this third thing, this hybrid being. And the question was, why did God put that knowledge off limits? There's a sense in which what humans can do with that is immensely creative. The stories that follow in Genesis include this explosion of creativity, agriculture, metalworking, art, music, city building, etc. Also murder.
Right.
So there's a sense in which obtaining that knowledge creates an extraordinary creature, but it's one that's very unstable and very dangerous. And so the story seems to be quite ambivalent about the place of humans and what the impact of that is going to be. And if you look back at scientific anthropology, obviously, we're part of the larger family of animals that includes the other primates. Our species doesn't evolve until about 300,000 years ago, so really recent. And there's a moment, we're not sure when, somewhere between 100,000 and 60,000, that humans' capacity for symbolic thought just explodes. And from that time on, the pace of change becomes extraordinary. And humans do all kinds of remarkable things spread out all over the globe. But we also begin to have outsized impact on the world. And our creativity means that our innovations move at a pace much faster than the evolution of other animals. And that means our impact on them has been devastating. Not because we were greedy, not because we were somehow unnaturally violent, but just because we're so damn clever.
Yeah.
So this cleverness is both a blessing and a real danger. And that's where I saw the stories coming together, at least as they were going to talk about the enigma and the problem.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I think very insightful about just the very particular and unique place that human beings occupy in this whole space. And you started with Job, and then we bounced back to Genesis, which people are probably very familiar with. But I wanted to give you the opportunity to dig a bit more into the Hebrew text around what are these biblical themes of land and agriculture, and kind of the question of, so then what for the human being, right? Okay. So if the human being is left to the human's own devices, obviously there is the great good and the great evil. And so throughout these texts, you get these limits, right? And I wanted you to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. There's two things I would say. First, about the initial creation stories. They have both a function as stories about origin, but they also have a function as a kind of ideal. And the first story, Genesis 1, which is usually associated with the priestly tradition. One of the interesting things there is that although human beings are given a very high-ranking place in the order of things, and we, in a sense, made in the image and likeness of God, and we are given dominion, which, of course, has been a controversial part of the Christian religious tradition, Jewish and Christian religious tradition in environmental discussion. But the nature and the way that dominion is exercised is not just go and do what you want. If you notice again, the food, God apportions food for all the animals, and the animals apart from humans are to be grazing animals. They eat grasses. Humans are to eat seed-bearing, seeds, fruits, etc. So everyone is vegetarian, if you will. From the priestly writer's view of original creation, there is no violence, no shedding of blood. And so that in itself, I think, shows, again, how reflective they could be about the ambivalence of certain things about our known relations with the world. Now later, after the flood story, actually, God does permit the eating of meat and the slaughter of animals, but, and this, I think, this is the origin of Jewish restriction on eating blood. It says, if you kill an animal, then you must pour the blood out, because the blood is the life. And basically it's saying the life of animals belongs to God. It does not belong to you.
What you can't do is consume life.
Yes, you cannot consume life. And so there's this balancing of the human needs and desires and the respect for animal life. And so again and again, there is never commodification of other beings. That extends actually also in interesting ways to land itself. In the second story, Genesis 2-3, we call it Garden of Eden, and I don't know what people think about when they think of garden, but it's definitely not, the well laid out garden with your little row crops and everything. It's actually, it's what we would call permaculture. That is, it's a tree garden with fruit. And so we think it was actually modeled on their understanding of oasis culture. If anyone's ever been around Jericho, there's water, which is also described in the story, the water that comes up from the ground, trees that just produce food on their own. And in oasis culture, humans have to do only a little tending. And so it's this is the image of paradise. It's the oasis garden. It's a permaculture environment. Now, the punishment after people get kicked out of the garden is field agriculture. Yeah. And the description of the field agriculture, by the sweat of your brow. The description of the field agriculture is one which they also recognize this can lead to depletion. It will only grow thorns and thistles. And that's an image of abused land. Mm-hmm. So there's a reflection on the fact that humans have, in some respect, in fact, God even says, cursed be the ground on account of you. So it's a rather sobering story. And if one just stopped there, it would be rather depressing. But if you continue going and you look, you see that actually the Israelite tradition, they realize that yes, as most of life as they knew it was field agriculture and pastoralism, herding goats, sheep, some cattle. But when you get into the legal material, they're very much concerned about, again, divinely imposed limits on how people treat the land, treat animals, etc. So well, there's lots of things that we could get into, but one of the things that I think is interesting is that the land and the animals are in essence seen as part of the community. Again, they're not commodified. Even land, we tend to think of, we have a long tradition of ownership of land.
Right.
Now, it is true by the 8th century, people were in fact buying and selling land. The prophets, Micah and Isaiah, in fact, rail against this because they see it as a betrayal of the older traditions. But in the older traditions, God gives the land to people as a heritage, nachalah, sometimes translated as inheritance, but it doesn't mean something that you get full title to. It always still belongs to God, but it is entrusted to people. And therefore, it cannot simply be commodified. And this is reflected in various ways in the Sabbath provisions. It is not only humans who celebrate, who honor the Sabbath by ceasing from work. In fact, if you look in Deuteronomy's version of the 10 Commandments, animals are also included as part of the community that is to celebrate the Sabbath. So they too are to rest. But in the laws about, in Exodus and in Leviticus, about sabbatical years, every 7th year, the land is to rest and crops are not supposed to be planted. So you can see that it's not property. Land is not property, but instead it's part of the community. And so it's included in the cycles of productivity and rest.
Yeah, these Sabbath years make a lot of sense when the land belongs to God and isn't used for profit and belongs to a person.
Yeah, and in fact, one of the most interesting places is on into the end of 2nd Chronicles, which is reflecting on the exile. Why did the exile happen, and how did the exile finally come to an end? And in 2nd Chronicles, it says that basically the people failed to honor the land's Sabbath and just kept working it. And that therefore, when the people were exiled, then the land could make up for the Sabbaths that it had been deprived of. And when the land had received back all of the Sabbaths that it should have had, then the people could return. And so it's a cautionary metaphor, I think, for the fact that if you do not honor the land, you will lose it.
In a culture and a time in which we are in a climate crisis, it rings quite powerfully, the idea of exile and of losing the land by not respecting it and treating it appropriately.
Yeah.
You had mentioned when you were preparing kind of for the Centennial Lecture about the idea of apocalyptic literature and also kind of the bright spot. And I in the work at Gipple often will talk about, there's the Genesis piece, but then as a good person who grew up in the Baptist tradition for a long time, I'm very familiar with Revelation.
Yes.
And like to at least pull on the strings that the end of the story, the promised creation, is sort of the city and the garden, but also just pure water from the throne of God. Yeah. And I just wonder if you could talk about that, but also how these apocalyptic traditions point us somewhere.
Yeah. The first couple of times I taught the course on the Bible and the Care of the Earth, I did not want to get to, I love apocalyptic literature as a biblical scholar. It's some of the most beautiful, imaginary scenes. But I thought, oh, great. Behold, a new heaven and new earth. The old one has passed away, and here's the new one. And I thought, great. Now we've got a model of a disposable earth.
Right. When are we getting rid of this one?
Yeah, it just seemed like a real problem. But when I finally came around after trying to figure out how, when we're talking about the seriousness of the problems, how do you avoid despair?
Yeah.
And I realized that this, I'll take a little while getting back to apocalyptic, but that's where I'm headed.
Good.
I realized that there are two kinds of time, the way time is constructed in the Bible. One of them, if you're reading through, say, Joshua through 2 Kings, we call this the Deuteronomistic history. And it's governed by a way of looking at things, which is, did you do well? Did you do badly? If you do well, then things are going to go well. If you screw up, you're going to suffer the consequences. So it's that kind of, I mean, it's this very earnest and it's very political literature. And so on the one hand, when we're motivating ourselves and realizing we're going to suffer the consequences of our actions, we're living that out in Deuteronomistic time. Now, the problem with Deuteronomistic time is that if you screw up badly enough, it goes kaflooey.
Yeah.
And so the end of 2 Kings, it's destruction and exile. And I thought, if that's the only way of thinking that we've got, we're going to have a hard time staying out of despair, because we are going to be so much more aware of all of our failures than we are of the ways in which we have been good stewards.
Right.
And so that can lead to a paralyzing fear. That's where I realized that the apocalyptic tradition has a different way of thinking about time and thinking about the place of people within time and thinking about God's faithfulness to creation. Apocalyptic is really about deep time. It tends to look not at this generation, this generation, this generation. Instead, it starts with the beginning and it looks to the end. And in many of the apocalyptic literature from not just in the Bible, but outside the Bible too, there is almost a kind of cyclical movement to it. And I realized, I thought, well, I'm trying to think where to, this is a text most people won't know. I work on the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I absolutely love the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I think that they're very insightful. And when I was working on this lecture, I realized that there was the words from this Dead Sea Scroll kept coming into my mind because it was focused on what it called God's creation of the ages of old, reaching back to creation, looking to the eschaton. And it said not only that God who established them, but established them according to all the plans for them, for all the eternal epochs. And I thought, this is putting me in mind of what geologists discovered about deep time of the earth. And so I let my mind go there instead of just back to when humans emerged as a species and what we've done. I let my mind go back to I love geology too, the Cambrian, the Ordovician, the Silurian, the Devonian, the Carboniferous, all those wonderful epochs of the world. And I realized that those epochs, many of them, were punctuated by what we call the Great Extinction events, in which an age came to an end, and sometimes a catastrophic end. And of course, one of the things that we're struggling with right now is the recognition that we may be on the verge of the 6th Great Extinction. Right. And so as I read with the geologists who described, the various extinction events, and one of my favorite writers, Tim Flannery, who's a brilliant science writer, and he talked about these and he said, every extinction event brings one age to an end, but it is also the gateway to another age. And it opens up evolutionary doorways that had previously not been there. And so I started to think in terms of, this was what, especially my Dead Sea Scroll hymn was talking about, because it talking about God bringing one age to an end and establishing another. And I thought, that's not so different from how secular geologists would talk about nature as one age comes to an end and another one unfolds. Now, obviously, this sixth extinction, it's not caused by an asteroid or volcanism, but by the actions of this one overly clever but not very wise species. And so that's
something not quite an animal, something not quite a god.
Yeah. And so, there is grief and judgment as we realize our responsibility. But it is also important to remember that we are not the only force. That even if we destroy something that has been extraordinarily beautiful, to speak in secular terms, nature will find those evolutionary pathways and create something new and beautiful and unimaginable over that long epochal time. Or if you want to talk in theological terms, this is God, the Alpha and Omega, or this is the Holy Spirit imbued in the fabric of creation that creates anew, even when there has been destruction. And so I realized that I needed to move back and forth between the responsibility focus of that Deuteronomistic imperative, that prophetic word, but also the realization, as God says to Job, if you put yourself at the center of things, you will despair. What you have to realize is that you have a place within a larger world, of which a world of God's creation and God's care, and that your failures can be taken up into this larger perspective. The evil that you do, the evil that is done against you, also is taken into this larger picture in which God's fidelity can be counted on. And that's the reason why you were talking about, yes, what's the image then in Revelation, where after the judgment on the earth, which is envisioned in many respects as a judgment, though it is caused by the wickedness of humans and their imperialistic regimes of power, the consequences fall in large measure also upon the earth. But the new heaven and the new earth are recreated. And it is a place, as you say, a place where water is at the center and the tree of life. And the odd thing, as you pointed out, is that it's not just, well, let's go back to the garden. It's that the garden has intersected with the city. So the New Jerusalem, the urban area, is the place where the tree of life and the river of life are flowing.
Yeah, so the picture is so captivating because it isn't, we spend so much time, or at least the way that I grew up in my tradition, right, was we spend so much time looking backward.
Yeah.
How do we get back?
Yes.
And actually this prophetic tradition is that it's actually, there's a beauty forward. There's a different thing that is promised and that we're kind of called to move into and try to create.
Mm-hmm. And, I think it's not just, on the one hand, yes, it's this transcendent vision, but on the other hand, transcendent visions, like the utopian origin paradise gardens, they can both be stimulating for the way in which we anticipatorily live them out. And so I think some of the most exciting, interesting things in environmental practice today are ways of greening the city, the ways in which cities can become, it's not just a matter of mitigating the impact of the city, but really rethinking the city as a place of food production, of carbon absorption, and by allowing the land out, making the cities more compact, allowing the land outside to be rewilded. Those are remarkable visions which come quite close to drawing on, I think, those apocalyptic visions of the eschatological reality.
Well, thank you so much for spending some time this morning. You know, I think both the kind of how do we take everything in, be honest with ourselves about what we've done and the status of the world without despair, and how do we back out and see this macro sense of time, like you talked about, and gain some of these insights about what the future of the world might look like, or what God's vision of what a new paradise might look like to bring down into this time to influence our action, hopefully harness this cleverness, which I think you rightly point out, I think is the mission upon us. So thank you so much for spending some time with us this morning, Dr. Newsom. I really appreciate it.
It's been a real pleasure. I appreciate it.